Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today, or good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you might be. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, let me firstly tell you a little bit about Braeburn Whisky. We have offices in Scotland, Spain, Singapore, and we also have a private bonded warehouse in Speyside. And we are the founders of the world's first whiskey cask index, the BC20. What is whiskey cask investment? Well, the concept of investing in whiskey is a simple one. You're essentially purchasing a cask of whiskey at a given age, holding that cask through a period of maturation as the whiskey ages and appreciates in value, then selling that cask back into the market at a profit. The graph here clearly illustrates how, as the cask ages and the whiskey matures, the value of your investment appreciates. You can see as the cask passes around the 16-year-old mark here that the appreciation starts to accelerate as the whiskey becomes increasingly scarcer. Today, I'd like to briefly discuss an important aspect of whiskey investing that I'm sure every investor wants to have a clear understanding of, which is exit strategies. Obviously, for your investment to work, you need a clear exit. We're quite often asked by clients, should I bottle my cask or is there an alternative exit? Well, there are two options to cask owners who are ready to monetize their investment, and that is bottling or reselling the cask as a whole. As we all know, all whiskey will eventually be bottled and in most cases consumed. And we quite often work with clients to bottle their cask, and I've got a few examples here on the screen of bottlings that we've worked with our clients to produce. Working with our clients and our sister company, we've actually bottled some pretty spectacular whiskies, and you can see here on the screen that we have a bottling of the Macallan 1991 that was produced exclusively for the Peninsula Hotel in Shanghai as part of the Scottish folklore series from Cask 88, the triple gold medal winning Ben Nevis 45-year-old, which is named the Cat She. A mythical hound that roams the Highlands, and you have the Lefroy 19, the Calig Fiera, or in Gaelic, better known as the Winter Queen. But should you bottle? There's a couple of other examples there for you as well of bottlings that we've been involved with. This is the Peninsula Macallan here, the 1991. But should you bottle your cask in order to monetize your investment? Well, having gone through the process of securing your cask, transferring the ownership of that cask, allowing the whiskey to mature in the cask in a bonded warehouse, you have the option to sell the whole cask whilst it's still in bond. At this point, I just quickly like to touch on valuations, how we value your cask and how you can track the asset's appreciation. When we're valuing a cask, we take a number of different characteristics or elements of the cask into consideration. Distillery. Obviously, this is pretty important. The profile of the distillery, the availability of whiskey in the market, and retail prices are something that we consider. Volume, how much liquid and alcohol is in the cask that you own. Obviously, age, we take into consideration sometimes region, and quite important as well, cask type, whether that be a sherry cask, a bourbon cask, a wine cask, or increasingly more popular now, rum casks as well. You can see here from this particular example you can see here from this particular example that our client bought a Kalia 2007 cask, currently aged at 13 years. They bought this in November 2015 at around this point for a price of £7,250. over the course of the past 5 years, the cask has been steadily appreciating in value. And based on all the elements that I just mentioned, we currently value this cask at £15,239, which is a 110.19% return. Given that bottling can be quite time consuming, the question is, who do I sell my casks to? Private investors or bottlers? As I said, given that bottling can be quite time consuming, costly in terms of bottling costs and the payments of taxes, as well as presenting the investor with a challenge of potentially protracted process of marketing and selling the bottles, we in most cases would recommend selling your cask as an entire cask while still in bond. Age will in most cases determine or dictate who your cask is sold to. A cask that still has the potential for an additional period of maturation will typically find its way into the hands of another investor or collector who will benefit from another period of appreciation as this whiskey becomes increasingly rarer. In the event a whiskey has reached a point where additional maturation isn't any longer viable, perhaps a 30-year-old cask with an ABV approaching 40%, this being the minimum alcohol level for the whiskey to still be considered whiskey. This whiskey is now ready to be bottled and will be sold onto an independent bottler to be released as a spectacular rare whiskey bottling. It's very important at this stage that I point out that by taking the route of selling the cask as a whole, you can take advantage of the tax benefits associated with selling an asset that currently enjoys the status of wasting asset. This is due to the fact that the whiskey cannot mature indefinitely as evaporation takes the alcohol level down towards that all-important number of 40% ABV. As a result of this, the sale of your cask while still in bond attracts no capital gains tax, which is clearly a preferred route for investors that are looking to maximize their returns. And the other consideration is liquidity, i.e. how easily can you realize a return? It's a pretty important consideration. As you can imagine, the process of selling a whole cask is far quicker and less complicated than bottling. When the time comes to realize your return on your cask, this cask will be offered to our extensive network of investors, collectors, and independent bottlers. And this is a relatively quick process, depending on the age and value of the cask. As you can probably imagine, some of these more valuable casks that are running into hundreds of thousands of pounds may take a little longer to sell. But I always point out to clients when discussing exits that they are putting a rare whiskey into market, of which there's a very high demand. And as long as the cask is priced according to the market, you'll have no difficulty selling that cask. As I pointed out earlier, every cask ultimately will be bottled, in most cases consumed, and there is, as we all know, a shortage of well-aged whiskies in the market. So again, exiting your cask as a whole while still in bond is a relatively fast and efficient way of realizing a return on your investment. Just to sort of highlight some of the examples of clients that have bought casks from us and subsequently put those casks back into the market. I've got a couple of testimonials here. This particular investor, as you can see, once the dip his toe in the water, we've subsequently sold the cask for him. He bought a cask of Highland Park 2001. In 2007, it was a 6-year-old. He paid £9,250 for that particular cask, and it was resold on his behalf in August 2020 as a 19-year-old Highland Park for a price of £45,550. Another example of a successful investment, an investor that's having bought the cask, successfully exited that, put it back into the market and realized the return. Client here, as you can see, lives in Hong Kong, wanted to invest in whiskey from Scotland. He was very successful with his investment, as you can see, and as a result of that has been very comfortable recommending friends and family to us. He bought in June 2016 a 28-year-old Macallan cask. It's a 1988 Macallan. Paid £138,990 for that, and that was resold on his behalf in May 2020 as a 32-year-old Macallan for a price of £331,800. Again, a spectacular return over a relatively short period of time. So in summary, it is a very, very straightforward process. I'm constantly reminding investors that you're dealing with an asset that is extremely rare. Our sort of portion of the market is very small relative to the entire whiskey market, and we are dealing with rare, highly sought after assets. But a very brief presentation, but one that I would hope was giving you a pretty clear idea of how the investment works, and more importantly, how you can exit your investment, take advantage of the various benefits associated with selling a wasting, owning, selling a wasting asset, and taking advantage of the lack of capital gains tax. Very, very straightforward process. As I said, we utilize what is a very, very large network of investors, collectors, and independent bottlers from around the world who are constantly trying to source these rare and spectacular whiskies. I hope that's given anybody that was unsure about how the process works a bit of clarification. As I said, quite a short presentation, but I would be happy to take some questions from you if any amongst you would like clarification on some other parts of the investment. Spare me a second. Okay, I'll just have a quick look at what we've got here. So I have Sanin. What would be an average percentage of appreciation for a cask on cash return in a whiskey type investment? I've read in some places where they suggest for some cases as high as 500%. Is this real? And can you give us an example? The percentages you're looking at there, it's a bit of a difficult question to answer, because in terms of how a cask of whiskey will appreciate in value, there are a number of things to consider, as I previously said, in terms of the distillery, the type of cask. There are a lot of elements to consider when you're trying to sort of anticipate how a cask will appreciate in value. You've put a figure there of 500%. I have a feeling that might be related to some bottles. And obviously the return of 500% is very dependent upon the length of time that you actually own the cask for. And second question, as an alternative investment, is it possible to keep investments running so only returns will be taxed? Again, if I'm understanding you correctly, you are not, certainly in the UK, you are not taxed on the capital gains that you enjoy from the investment as a result or because the asset is considered by HMRC to be a wasting asset, i.e. there is evaporation that occurs over the course of the maturation period, and typically, you know, you wouldn't expect whiskey to sort of be maturing beyond 50 years old at an absolute maximum, I would say. So it is regarded as a wasting asset. I've been asked here, is there any charges to me if I sell the cask as a whole? The sort of short answer is no. You are very much in a seller's market when you have a cask that you're putting back into the market, and as long as I said, as long as there's priced according to the market, you'll have no difficulty selling it. We do charge for our services, as you can imagine, and what we tend to do is add a fee on the back end of an agreed value with the seller, and that fee will be paid by the buyer. And you might ask yourself, why would they pay that fee? Well, we're dealing with rare assets here, and whatever fee that we put on the sale, it is usually quickly absorbed by the appreciation and value of the cask over the sort of coming months. Again, I've been asked what fees you take out. I would hope that that clarifies that. I'm being asked the same question a number of times here. What costs are associated with it? Do we take care of the full selling process? The answer to that is yes, we do. We have a number of channels that we can put your cask through. Primarily, we offer it to our base of investors and collectors and bottlers, as I've said. We also have access to auction platforms, but typically your cask will go into our network again. Do we require insurance as the value goes up on the cask, or is this already covered within the bond payment? Your payments for the ongoing management of your cask, the storage and the insurance, which is, in our case is £65 a year, that covers all of the casks in our custody, regardless of the value. So in answer to your question, no, there's no increase in the cost of your insurance. You can sort of assume, obviously, over the course of time, inflation will have some impact on the cost of storage. Who to sell on to? How long does it take to sell on average? Well, that's again dependent upon the age of the cask. As you can probably imagine, you know, if you're putting a cask into the market that's valued around sort of £50,000, let's say, for argument's sake, that's a cask that will sell quite quickly. Conversely, if you have a cask that's valued at £500,000, that's obviously a cask that's only going to appeal to a particular type of investor or bottler, and it may take a little longer to actually turn that around. But if you're selling, I always say, a cask at sort of £50,000, then you can expect that to be sort of turned around within a week or so. Do we deal with individual casks or pallets when purchasing? We quite often offer a group of casks, you might call a pallet. This is something that we've done with new fill casks, for example. We offer them as a group of casks, but ordinarily you're dealing with individual casks. So I have something that's quite an interesting question here. Many small and medium distilleries are struggling economically as a result of the pandemic and US tariffs. 2021 likely to be a tough year. Are you anticipating a record volume of cask coming to the market as distilleries need to raise cash flow? Do you expect bargain cask prices compared to earlier years? It's an interesting one. First of all, perversely, the sort of current pandemic and the current crisis has actually had a positive impact on the market from an investor's perspective. Certainly, when we talk about US tariffs, the sort of current incumbent there introduced a 25% tariff on single malt age expressions or age statements. As a result of that, what distilleries have done is blended some of their older inventory to avoid the tax or the tariff that's associated with the age-dated whiskey. And that means, from our perspective, that these rare single cask, well-aged malt whiskies are becoming increasingly rare, and it can only have a positive impact on the value of your cask moving forward. I'll just have a look, just bear with me a second. I'm going to sort of see if we have any more questions in the other chat. Okay, I'm being asked, when I buy a cask, under whose name is it held? I hear different things from my friend and other companies. We are the custodians of your casks. We are the warehouse operators. Our team has the appropriate licensing. But in terms of actual ownership, you are the registered owner. There are documents to demonstrate that you are the beneficial owner of that particular cask, if that answers your question. Interesting. When buying a very young cask, this is from Michael, when buying a very young cask before it can be called whiskey, what sort of proportion of casks go bad before reaching the minimum age of 3 years to be called whiskey? It's not something I've ever encountered. There is obviously some scope for whiskey to be spoiled. On very, very rare occasions, you might have a sort of rivet come loose and fall into the whiskey. This could potentially spoil it. But you're dealing with a very, very simple liquid. It's alcohol and water. So there's no scope really for it going bad, if that answers your question. If I bought a cask, is it possible to transfer ownership? Absolutely. This is your cask. As long as it's maintained and stored in a bonded warehouse, then you are free to transfer ownership of that cask to wherever you want to do. Can potential investments be independently valued? If I'm understanding the question correctly, absolutely. You know, you can get a valuation. It's from anybody that you feel really qualified to give a valuation on the cask of whiskey. In fact, I would always encourage people, you know, before you make a cask investment, carry out you know, enough due diligence on pricing, ownership, and these sort of aspects of the investment, just to ensure you're comfortable with it and essentially fully understand the investment. So yeah, there's nothing going to stop somebody else putting a valuation on your whiskey, and I would assume that if they are qualified to make that valuation, they'll be taking into consideration all the elements that we previously discussed. Just have a little look here, see if we've got anything else. I have an anonymous. Can I buy from Malaysia? Well, the quick answer is absolutely yes. We deal with clients from every corner of the world. Asia obviously is a very important market for us. And if you, as a Malaysian investor, wish to own a cask of whiskey, then that's absolutely something that we can facilitate for you here at Braeburn Whisky. Simon is asking me, when would one know when is the best time to sell a cask? The beauty of owning a cask of whiskey is that one thing you can be assured of is that every year that your asset is going to naturally appreciate in value as a result of that maturation process. There are important milestones associated with the maturation of a cask of whiskey, and my sort of advice would, you know, if you are close to one of these milestones, hold the cask until it has passed that milestone, because that could have a significant impact on the value of the cask when you put it back into the market. In terms of when is the best time, we work together with our clients according, you know, depending on their sort of objectives and what strategy they're employing to determine the best time for them personally to sell that particular cask. I have here, you've told us the pros of investing and good price rises. What are the major risk factors in investing in a whiskey cask? Well, in whiskey in general, and one of the key things that every investor has to consider, obviously, is provenance. By virtue of the fact that your cask of whiskey is issued a unique identification number by HMRC, and that cask is subsequently stored inside a secure government bonded warehouse, you can be very, very confident as to the provenance of the whiskey cask you've invested in. Obviously, if you're investing in bottles, that isn't necessarily the case. Other risk factors, I think the main risk factor that we would all sort of be aware of is the strength and robustness of the whiskey market. And if we look at sort of current figures and we look at what's happened over the past year, consumption of whiskey continues to increase. This gap that I often talk to my clients about between supply and demand continues to increase. More and more people are discovering whiskey for the first time, more and more affluent drinkers that want to very much enjoy these older age expressions, which essentially is the area of the whiskey industry that we work within. So yeah, the robustness of the market, demand for whiskey, obviously if that was to fall for some reason, you would imagine that's going to have a negative impact on the value of the cask. Nothing at all suggests that's going to happen anytime soon. As I've said, this gap between supply and demand continues to widen. Whiskey is becoming increasingly popular, and every year we see new consumers coming into the market. I'm being asked a question here. I think I've already addressed it, but I'll sort of address it again. In your experience, how long usually does it take to resell a cask? For what reason or factors could it be difficult to sell that particular cask? It's an interesting thing, because the one key element to your asset that sort of makes it different from a lot of other assets that you could consider investing in is that this asset, this liquid, this whiskey, will one day be consumed. So you know that there is a need for more and more whiskey to satisfy this demand. What factors could make it difficult to resell your cask? Well, if it's not priced according to the market, then clearly it's not going to be attractive to either an investor or a bottler. And how long does it usually take? It very much depends on the value of your cask. As I've said, if you've got sort of a cask that's in the region of £50,000 in terms of value, or sort of below the £100,000 mark, these are casks that typically sell very, very quickly. You would imagine that we'd probably be able to turn that sort of sale around within a week to 2 weeks. But with the more expensive, the more sort of blue chip casks that command hundreds of thousands of pounds, as I said, these are for a particular type of investor, and they may take a little longer to sell. But ultimately, every single cask of whiskey sells. I think I pretty much answered all of your questions. Again, I'm being asked about personal tax implications. I'm not a tax advisor. Obviously, you always, in any sort of investment scenario, you need to take independent advice on your own personal tax situation. But certainly in the UK, as a result of whiskey or maturing whiskey in a cask enjoying the status of wasting asset, as a result of this, when you come to sell the cask, there is no capital gains tax liabilities. Again, if that would apply to you, depending on where you are, I couldn't possibly comment. Okay, I think I've answered everything there. If you've got any more questions, I have one last one. Sherry, wine, bourbon, peated, which is best going forward? This is a question from Yama. Well, if you have seen the BC20 whiskey index, you'll see there that it gives a clear indication that sherry casks are increasingly popular. They do command a premium when you come to sell these casks. They're extremely popular. And the same applies to a certain extent with wine, whether it be peated or unpeated. That really doesn't impact the value of your cask. You know, there are a large number of people that enjoy peated whiskies, and conversely a large number of people that enjoy unpeated whiskies. So that's not really something you take into consideration. But certainly the cask type, sherry, wine or bourbon, yes, that's going to have an impact on the value of your cask. And from what we have seen, historical data tells us that sherry casks are the best performing type of casks. How often do you get updates on your cask portfolio? We will update that annually. So you will see on a year-to-year basis the appreciation in value as the cask goes from one year to another. When should one sell a Springbank 1992 cask? It's a lovely question. Again, you know, there is no sort of particular, you know, there's no sort of exact science, if you will, on that. The key thing to remember is that obviously if your cask is approaching, as a 1992 cask, it's quite an old cask, a wonderful cask of whiskey, I might add. But the concern is that you don't allow that ABV, that alcohol by volume, to fall below 40%, because at that point your cask, your whiskey is essentially ruined. So again, without sort of knowing the specifics of that particular Springbank cask, I couldn't really give you any sort of advice as to when might be appropriate to sell it. Peter Seddon says, how are your valuations justified? Very good question. As I previously pointed out, we take into consideration a number of elements when looking at your cask of whiskey. Primarily, we use historical data. This is what prices of casks that previously commanded in the market and sold for. And we use the BC20 index, the algorithm associated with the BC20 index, which, as I said, takes into consideration the region, the distillery, the age of your cask, the wood type, and a number of other elements. So you'll find our projections based on all of that information are quite accurate. Okay, I think I've answered everything there. There are a number of questions coming in that are essentially sort of repeating stuff that I've already answered. So I'm going to sign off. I hope that has been of some use to you. I hope it's given us just a bit of a clearer idea of how you monetize your investment in a whiskey cask. And thank you for joining us, and thanks for your questions. I'll bid you all a good day and look forward to hopefully welcoming you, if you're not already a client, welcome you on board as a client in the future. Thanks for attending. Cheers.